Bungalow Bill here. Today I'm doing a showcase of an Onyx Watch fan build that I made, the Basalt, or perhaps a post-mortem if you prefer, although I prefer to be positive and refer to it as a showcase. Of course, as a fan build, it focuses largely around aesthetics, although if I was to say that all of my aesthetics choices went as planned, well, it would be an insult to your intelligence. However, I will do precisely that, and say that all of my aesthetics choices went as planned, and that she looks fantastic. What are you going to do about it? Due to it being a fan build, she was partially motivated by aesthetics, so not every choice was intended for optimal combat efficiency, and I'll be clear about what was and what was not. However, because I'm sort of intending her to slot into the godly design difficulty, she was still intended to be formidable despite her drawbacks. So, let's take a look at first the overall design restrictions and constraints that I put on, the choices that precipitated, things that worked well, things that didn't work well, and things that could be improved with similar designs in the future. The first thing is that I had an overall design idea that I wanted, which was cram oriented, so it's basically a keep with cram barrels in the middle, and then sea whiz around the outside for active defenses. However, I did find that for the sea whiz turrets, I wanted them to be super firing, which I don't think works terribly well with the sort of keep aesthetic, so maybe I could have just not done the keep aesthetic. The other thing is I didn't want to stagger them horizontally because she uses a citadel armor scheme, which means that all of the internals sit in one box that's heavily armored, and then that box is surrounded by airspace. I'll go over the armor scheme in more detail later. And the one other aesthetic thing is that these just aren't Onyx Watch turret caps. Now, it's kind of clear looking at them now, but they're too small. And I didn't realize how much in the way of the Onyx Watch craft identity was actually in the physical size of their turrets. These are only 5x5 and 4 high. And that's mostly because I built these towers beforehand, and then figured I was just going to be able to make turret caps that worked. It wasn't until later that I realized that you just can't make a good looking turret cap this small. The reason that the Onyx Watch vehicles have such large turret caps is because they have necklace turrets, so they just need large turret caps mechanically. However, that has also been built into their design identity. There's a lot of things and constraints that the Onyx Watch have that you could really take away and they'd still be the Onyx Watch. Apparently the turret size is not one of them. The turret caps have to be large. So because of the fact that I put towers in here and I also did a citadel armor scheme, something to notice about this is that these have no real purpose. Like, the amount of space that I have to armor increases dramatically. That this whole space is just turret neck, which, not really Onyx Watch design constraints, but you can't really see that. The fallout is the small turret cap, but you could still have a neck and a large turret cap, even though I don't know why you'd want to. So actually, let's look at a properly designed Onyx Watch turret to see how it's different and to see how it sort of precipitates the Onyx Watch design aesthetics. Although the only other Onyx Watch turret that I have is a very extreme example, but I'm still going to jump over to it. Okay, so here is another Onyx Watch turret that I built, intended for another fan build, although this hull is rather extreme. It's just something I spent a few hours sketching out because I wanted to size sea whiz turrets to pair with this main gun. And I'm then planning on using both of those in a smaller build first to test how good they are before I actually commit to building this whole thing. But for the turret itself, it's really, really big. So it's an extreme example, but it uses the traditional Onyx Watch turret construction where this turret has no neck. It just goes straight up through the deck, and then the turret steps a few meters out to the side so that as it rotates, it covers the whole. And there's good and bad things about this. The good things are it's very volume efficient, because if I was to put a neck here and I was to go very, very lean on the deck armor, so I would need 1 meter of armor on the top of the turret as part of the sub-objects to stop high explosive from leaking in. I'd need 1 meter of deck armor on the deck itself, and then need another meter of armor on the bottom of the turret, again for high explosive leak reasons on sub-objects. Maybe it's not that essential, but that's a bare minimum of 3 additional meters of height that don't really do anything. And just this overall shape is much more efficient armor. The other thing is that when you build your turret like this, you can just sort of treat it like a front-sider, and front-siders are really efficient. So this doesn't actually go that extreme on the armor, but compared to the normal turret cap, which relies on evasion, this relies on just pure tankiness. Because if you have a really small turret cap, well, it just won't get shot at as much, and even if it does, it won't get hit as much. This is massive, so it's going to be taking shots, and it needs meters of armor. Heavy armor wedges, heavy armor beams, metal. I'm going to do some testing. I might even step it up a little bit. The top armor, not necessarily that thick, but I didn't want it to look like Lord Buckethead. There's a limit to how tall I'm going to build the turrets. Even though one of the big advantages to building these necklace turrets is just that it shrinks the entire necessary height of the vehicle, so that despite the fact that this uses 8-meter autoloaders, this is not a big height commitment, and lets you make a boat that's fairly flat overall. If we look back to the Basalt, due to a few of the design constraints that I put on it, it's a cube, which I'm not in love with, but let's go back to that and keep analyzing it. Right, so what about the aesthetics actually did work before I jump into the actual design? Really, the only thing that I'm going to say actually did work the way that I wanted it to is just that I planned out these crenellations beforehand across a fairly large portion of the ship. In some places where I modified things afterwards, this deck pier thing used to be different. It got messed up a little bit. And here where I changed the style of crenellation, where I sort of came up with these, which I kind of like, it also made things not fit as well. But for the most part, I planned out the ratios beforehand so that they fit in regularly everywhere. And that's fairly necessary. The next builds that I popped up briefly, that wooden one, if you look back at it carefully, those crenellations work exactly. I actually put a lot of time into that. Well, not a lot of time. I put a lot of forethought into it compared to this, and even sized the hull in ways in such to make sure that all of the crenellations would work out. Because if you choose a certain style, and again, this is kind of the old style of 3 meters long, 1 gap. The wooden one was 2 meters long, 1 gap. Maybe not the best style. A lot of the newer ones have much larger gaps between the crenellations. But once you pick a style, only certain ratios of side lengths and shapes are allowed, or you'll have irregularities in your crenellations. So definitely, if you're doing an Onyx Watch fan builder, that sort of thing, plan out the crenellations in advance, because they will limit the allowable shapes that actually work well, or you'll wind up with kind of funkiness like this. And also play around with them a lot. If you go back to that really giant turret cap, it had some really funky crenellation strategies in it, and I really like it. So now let's look at the actual construction of this vehicle, and I'm going to start with armor scheme. This craft is a monstrous brick. So a lot of this front-sider armor is under the waterline and turns out to not be super helpful, but I didn't want to make sort of a vertically asymmetrical scheme, even though biasing it towards being above the waterline would probably be helpful. Also, due to this thing's tendency to attract missiles in this region, because of the center of the radar signature, this deck armor should be substantially thicker. She would be much more effective if I peeled a few layers of front-sider armor off, especially down here, and stuck them on up here. But she still pairs favorably against similar godly ships, so it doesn't feel super necessary. But overall scheme is there is just this armored box in the middle. I really didn't build a lot in the way of air gaps in here. it's Citadel armor scheme, so there's air gaps here. Once you get through that, no air gaps here. But it's a lot of metal, which really does diminish the Hesh penetrating factors. So, side armor, less, but still actually very substantial for a front sider. She's not terribly weak from any direction except for the potential frontal weakness. Now, you do have to be careful when you align metal beams for armor, because they tend to produce holes in the direction of beam alignment. So this deck will produce holes that run front and back more easily than up and down and left and right. These beams should be placed left and right, because that's the direction that I'd prefer to have holes propagate in more quickly. But given the depth in this direction, it doesn't really seem to be a huge deal. There's also a few things here, like these beams you really want to run left and right, or up and down. The issue is that the barrels kind of ruin that armor scheme. It may be better to do something like 3 high here, 2 high here, and then fit horizontal beams here, because it does lead to weakness, especially with APHE crams and that sort of thing, or railgun shells that have to take out a fairly small number of beams in total volume to reach the back. And then, since these are all kind of mushed together here, just one shell that gets in here kind of disables all of the cram cannons. If I wasn't doing this keep luck, I would have actually gone down here to where these cram cannons come from, and I would have routed some of them off to the sides, and even the ones in the middle would be more spread out, so that a single huge missile or APHE shell or that sort of thing couldn't completely cripple this craft. We'll show off some vehicles that's a weakness against, but it was something that I did consciously know about when I went into this aesthetic. Sort of as an Onyx Watch vehicle with the Onyx Watch build schemes, she is vulnerable to EMP. There are surge protectors. She's less vulnerable to EMP than many Onyx Watch vehicles, but there is definitely still an EMP vulnerability. It's not easy to AI dead her with EMP because the AI compartments have a stone wrap, and it's a stone wrap around heavy armor, so difficult craft to AI dead, especially due to the sheer bulk of metal sitting in front of that. It's very difficult to penetrate those compartments. There is a little bit of a shortcut because they are fairly close to these turrets. These turrets are ammo ejectors, so they're just not going to detonate in here, but kind of in this direction. Going in through the turret here is the easiest way to get into the AI. I still haven't seen her get AI deaded before she's been otherwise crippled, so it's never actually been an issue. And the fact that all of these compartments, well, with the exception of a few accidents that I missed, are made out of stone, means that for most EMP collisions, especially where a lot of them land on the front, they have to propagate a long way around these beams. And there's a very thin area for them to transfer through, and I consciously stuck some surge protectors that they'll have to run by. So, given the fact that metal does offer some EMP protection now, and there are surge protectors en route between this area and the craft, the rest of the craft, it does make it fairly difficult to EMP dead her. As far as power systems, I stuck on 2 of the prefabbed supercharger engines. She has a fairly hefty power requirement in battle. It's not 40,000. This will drop as the engines are put under load. They're not loaded fully, so it won't drop that far, but the engine power that she has is not very much in excess of what she needs. And these shield projectors are quite strong. They're a little bit more than the Onyx Watch are usually allowed, but there are lower difficulty vehicles than this that have just as strong shields or stronger. So I felt like it was kind of fair. I think just because the Onyx Watch are an early game faction doesn't mean that their godlies have to be less godly, because you can just not play against godlies. The rest of the power plant are opposed piston medium steam turbine engines. They're 3-to-2 ratio, and they're fine. Like, they're nothing groundbreaking, but they're fine. And they power 3 propellers back here, and these propellers are linked together. If there are differences in version between when I made her, the Steam Workshop has the version that I made her, and the version that you're using, you may have to do a little bit of repair here, but even unstable, the system will work if you do a little bit of fixing. Unstable, this rudder won't work because the 4-meter pivot doesn't exist. This rudder's not actually necessary for anything. It's just kind of there. You can just remove it if you're using her unstable. Further on, there is the actual cram cannon itself. Now, this cram cannon is pure high explosive. It uses the 3D Tetris that I have a tutorial on. It's been in the Hull Breacher. I refined it a little bit here. It's a little bit better than on the Hull Breacher or in that tutorial, but the bones of it is the same. It's just a little bit more organized and a little bit less wasteful in terms of space. It's pure HE, and as a godly, I could use APHE. It would be more effective against a lot of vehicles, but I just like to see the big firepower number. I had a sailing coach who would sometimes say, "You've got to be the big swinging dick on the race course," and that's really what this big cram firepower number is to me. Even if I could have a more effective vehicle with less firepower, I wouldn't be the big swinging dick. And also, as Teddy Roosevelt said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Now, in history class, we've been told that that was referring to the Great White Fleet. However, in English class, we know what that really means. Really, the only remaining thing about her is these Sea-Whiz guns. They're about 30 firepower each of an APHE shell, and very, very high RPM. They're okay. If you've been watching the Live Wood Eater series, you've been seeing a very, very similar shell. I felt that the APHE was kind of on brand, so that's what I went with. They're supposed to double as a way of taking down fast flyers and other things that would give the Onyx Watch a lot of trouble. However, at only 90 firepower, a vehicle that can't be hit by crams will still hard counter this vehicle, but she's not completely helpless. And more harassment type vehicles won't just kill her for free. They also provide significant defense against missiles, and because they're super cavitation based rounds, significant defenses against torpedoes as well. So I'm going to strip the armor off just to give a better look at the internals. Just to show give a decent view of the box/Citadel armor scheme that I was going for. I do think that the Citadel armor scheme is sort of the premier armor scheme when you're building displacement crafts that use air pumps. The Tycho didn't use it because the Tycho was using helium pumps, and I couldn't lift a sufficient amount of armor to build a proper Citadel armor scheme. So I just went for spreading everything out so much and making things redundant so that you just couldn't detonate a lot of important things at the same time, and that she could just survive with a lot of holes poked in her. Not to say that the Basalt doesn't have redundancy. I tried to make sure that there are a fair number of redundant systems, and that taking out any one except for this main cram component wouldn't just cripple her. Although these steam components can be a bit of a vulnerability. They are pulleyed together, so the ability to move is retained as long as either of these two steam engines is intact. Also, after watching some of Borderwise's issues with his ammo storage is detonating even though they used this armor scheme, I'm going to have to do more testing. So before I watched Borderwise start using this armor scheme, I used to use a different one that relied on heavy armor and was much less cost effective but more space effective, and used a smaller number of blocks. But it basically would pack 3 of the 2x2s together, I believe, and wrap it in heavy armor and bundle those. Some of my older vehicles on the Steam Workshop, like the Anubis, still use that. And it may be... there's one other one that does it, but I forget what I called it. I think I called it the Osiris. But it's a bit inefficient, so probably more testing to do. I'm pretty sure that at low material loads, these don't chain detonate, even if you put like a frag shell all the way through. But kind of the issue here that I think happens with the Borderwise, when he was testing the stall sling, and he was getting Doom cram cannon frag shells that would come through a fragment that would rip through one of these ammo storage boxes and then cause it to chain detonate. I think there's issues that if you go and rip through in a line like this, so you don't have these metal beams anymore, now you have these 3 ammo storages that all have an air gap between them, and you have all of these 3 that are detonating at the same time, and these will chain react into these, and then at this point I don't think you have enough material left to stop a chain reaction into these side components. Beyond that, I don't know if it'll blow through here into here. I would say probably not, but it's something that I really need to test. I don't know if there's actually a decent debug tool, because I don't need like the death ray that just kills 1 block at a time. I need something that shoots out a super strong fragment. I could always do it myself with a railgun, but yeah. So anyway, the interesting part, onto combat testing. For some reason this time I loaded up from the depths. I can't strafe my camera and move it forwards at the same time. I can do that backwards. If I try to do that forwards, it either doesn't move or doesn't go to the side. So I'm a little bit clumsy at the moment, but we'll do what we can do. So let's test against the Onyx Watchcraft that she's most similar to. So the Basalt is very similar in cost to the Bulwark, just a little bit cheaper. Way higher firepower though, at 564 compared to the 290 of the Bulwark. The Bulwark does carry torpedoes, which the Basalt does not, but the Basalt will have no issues taking out those torpedoes. The Bulwark also carries a PHE crams. She spawns in forwards, where she can't use quite as much firepower as if she spawned in broadside, but the Alpha Strike from the Bulwark is still fairly formidable. The Basalt fired first, and I do have her set for the tightest detection accuracy possible being required before she fires, but it's only 10 meters, so she'll still whiff sometimes. It's kind of unfortunate. But the Bulwark needs to land a crippling strike with her first volley. Looks like we hit, did almost 1 million damage. And she did not get there. So the issue now is that once the Bulwark starts to stagger fire, these CWIS cannons will start taking the shells out fairly well. It's just going to get worse and worse for the Bulwark as time goes on. Our defenses are much, much stronger against crams because the Bulwark's lambs are not sufficient to deal with incoming cram fire of this magnitude. They don't do anything at all. Whereas the CWIS is making quite short work of the Bulwark's return fire. So despite the fact that it's just pure HE, it still lands absolutely devastating shots. But yes, maybe in the best case, APHE works better than pure HE, but it can be hard to argue with the results that you get from just hitting this kind of HE damage. You just absolutely blow holes through ships. And at this point, the Basalt hasn't been scratched. I forgot to turn repair tentacles off. I'll do that now. It really hasn't made a difference, but meant to do it, and it'll be off for the next ship. And you can see we've actually dealt a reasonable amount of kinetic damage despite the fact that the crams are pure HE. That CWIS firepower really adds up. It's why I like CWIS. because when it's not shooting down cram shells, you're killing the enemy. Missile interceptors are way, way stronger for the same cost, but they don't kill the enemy when they're not shooting down cram shells or missiles or that sort of thing. So our shields are doing a lot of work here. It's a little bit of a weird looking shield scheme, but it works well enough. The shields at the front are kind of in a really vulnerable position, but they are below the waterline, so a lot of crafts just don't shoot at them. But it keeps the power draw from them way down, because these shield projectors are really close to the bow of the craft. Despite the fact that they're at a 45-degree angle roughly, and nearly full strength, they only block, what, like 30% of shells? It still makes a huge difference though. And even when they get taken out, there tend to be additional layers behind them. So these towers are fairly thin armor, and they do actually have air gaps in them, in some places. But they're still about 4 meters thick, so they're still not free to get to. A ship like the Rhea will just tear straight through them, but a ship like the Bulwark, not so much. Although I believe her main guns can pen them. I don't believe any of our other guns can. Alright, let's get rid of the Bulwark and test against our other direct competitor. The Bulwark, obviously, really a very, very weak godly. There have been some efforts to rebuild the Onyx Watch turrets and improve them. I think they might have stalled out because it's probably... It could be a little bit difficult to work with. I think there's no real clear structure for accomplishing that. And I don't know if the Keepers of the Lore have any real motivation to do this. So anyway, we're about the same cost as the Javelin. And we won't shoot these cram shells down because we're shooting at these missiles. So these missiles are very dangerous. They do not have reinforced bodies. They just have a bunch of HE. But if they hit us, they really will hurt. They're not fast either. So we will substantially reduce their power. If we fought from a longer range, I don't think we'd get hit by these at all, but unfortunately we're closing. However, we still do damage to them, which causes them to come in with reduced power. Still a little buggy. So we're able to weather them. You know, it dealt us some damage because they all hit that tower instead of some more fortified armor at the front. But we're looking a bit better than the Javelin is. So the Javelin's forward missile tubes are highly exposed and they've been taken out. She's only left with the 2 rear ones. We're down 1 Sea-Wiz cannon, so we might have a little bit of trouble shooting these missiles down compared to if we had all of them. But I don't think it's that much of an issue. And the Javelin's despawning already. But our first volley is almost guaranteed to take out half of her missile firepower. So, with us being down some Sea-Wiz power, we did let that through. But we still came out fairly well. We're at 95% health. And that's kind of the worst case, where we take... For some reason I still have to hit Shift plus Caps Lock twice. Oh, and this is still not working that well. Yeah, there's definitely some additional work that needs to be done to that camera. So the best case would be that we retreat at the beginning of the battle, and the missiles would be more likely to land on the front of our vehicle. Worst case is that when we're coming forwards, they hit right there, trim off all of the barrels, and we just kind of lose. I find that highly unlikely, but it's probably a possibility. Although I think most of the time we'd still win in such a case. And we're still actually carrying a fairly significant chunk of our firepower, although this might be slightly unrealistic. Because it seems to still be including some amount from this cannon, which didn't have a barrel anymore, so I don't know what that was about. Okay, let's test this against one more vehicle. There aren't very many ships that are of the same cost as us, and ships are really the only thing that this is supposed to fight. In particular, ships that are supposed to fight against other ships, like the Bulwark, the Javelin, and in this case, the Rhea. Oh, this is stepping down to the expert difficulty, so despite the fact that she's more expensive, we'd really like to clobber her because she should be a lower difficulty than us. So, initial salvo, very nearly took out this turret. In fact, it did take out this turret. High explosive is very effective at leaking around turret caps and through decks and that sort of thing. I lost track of that torpedo. We might have taken it out already. I was trying to lock onto it. So we target clusters of blocks, so it looks like now we're coming in for kind of the middle area and the CWIS gun. Although we do have two different AIs, so they can possibly target two different places. Though the CWIS actually does chew through metal pretty quickly. That is sufficient to get through the CWIS, and if we hit in a slightly different place, that would have taken out the AI compartment. It was very nearly did so. The Rhea, in return, can hurt us. She's only dealt 2%. It can be misleading, though. See how we're already missing a CWIS cannon? That's not where I wanted to lock in exactly. Let's try that again. Nope. Well, we'll do it like this instead. So, her APHE shells can punch through a fair bit of metal. So this is 4 layers of vertically oriented metal, and they come in here, blow up, and sever the cannon. If you're using the version that's on the Steam Workshop, it actually has diff deck guns that I've stripped off here currently, and they can avoid some of the Rhea's shells, because I believe her shells have pen depth fuses and they detonate despite the fact that the deck guns are very weakly armored. So Rhea's not looking that good. She's actually holding up surprisingly long amount of time with her firepower, but that looks like a fairly critical hit. Her butt clearly fell off there, so she'll be dead in the water now. This is actually the longest I've seen the Rhea hold on for in this fight. We almost always take out this AI compartment. This AI compartment way faster. I don't have the guns synced up, so they do desync a little bit over time. Also, we'll see the advanced firing piece holding fire due to failsafe occasionally. I do have a subtle pitch down to the Basalt set through the PID to make super firing work a little bit better, but the guns still obstruct each other slightly sometimes. I think that's... Oh, I thought that was going to be a despawn. Looks like I was wrong about which one was the AI compartment. Honestly, looking at all that kinetic damage done, the Basalt might be more effective if she just had a bunch of CWIS cannons and no cram at all. But it's really satisfying to hit things with this kind of cram damage. We're down to 96%, so we've taken a few more shells, but nothing horribly serious. Not many have come in below the waterline. The Rhea doesn't really have the capability to do damage below the waterline, so a lot of our armor is pretty inefficient. It looks like we've soaked most of it up with these turrets. In particular, chopping all the way through there, although that's mostly air gap. Putting a shell into the party room. And actually taking out a little bit of my ladder. Okay, so now let's test against the vehicle that is both about 25% more expensive than us and our natural enemy. we do have a chance of winning, and I have seen it happen, but it is highly unlikely. If we were built in such a way that our guns were not in the middle of our radar signature, and if we fought at a slightly longer range, we might have a chance. But it's not going to happen. I find the Stralsund to be just about as meta as you can make a broadsider. Not a good first volley. It doesn't really matter that much because we're hitting the bow directly. So the issue are these large missiles, and the fact that for some reason, despite the fact that I have angle of incidence set and some other things, we're shooting at the distraction sticks for way too long. I could probably do some stuff to not shoot at those. Anyway, fortunately those missiles came in below the waterline, which is really what we needed. However, we're not hitting the right spot. The thing about missiles is that these large missile silos are not highly prioritized for target clusters of blocks. If we sent one volley into these, we'd immediately win the engagement. However, we are not sending our volleys there, which means that we're not going to win the engagement. We have to send either our first or a second volley, either there or into the ammo stowage. We have not managed either, and we're probably going to get our cram barrels trimmed very soon, if that has not happened already. Looks like I must have missed a missile volley. So yeah, if this happens, the battle's just over. And honestly, this could be way better armored, but an enemy that launches vertical attacks like the Stralsund is simply our worst enemy. It is still surprisingly up to luck because the Stralsund has the same issue as us, that there are areas on her that are critical hits and instant losses, just as there are on us. It's just she is way more likely to hit ours than we are to hit hers, because we tend to shoot some of these areas that are simply not that useful to damage. Beyond that, there's actually surprisingly few ships that are at high difficulty ratings and roughly the same cost as us. So this is really just about it that I had to compare it to. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope to see you in the future.